I wonder, I hope that he wasn't scared, that it all happened pretty quickly for him.
That John Denver died 25 years ago this week.
Was the song really born out of reconciliation or from conflict instead of love? Could John Denver's most famous ballad have its roots in a fight? And why, after decades of silence, did Annie finally share her side of the story at 78? For years, fans believed they knew the whole truth about John Denver.
Diving crews searched the waters of Monterey Bay for clues to the crash.
But in 2022, Annie broke her silence in a revealing podcast interview, opening up about their romance, their painful separation, and the real story behind the music. Today, we uncover the emotional, bittersweet, and sometimes shocking reality of their marriage, from tender love notes to a chainsaw incident. Truth about Annie's song. Finally told, for nearly 50 years, Annie's song has been celebrated as one of the most tender and poetic love ballads in American music. Fans long believed John Denver wrote it in a moment of passion, a luminous tribute to his first wife, Annie Martell. But in 2022, Annie herself, then 78, finally revealed a startling truth that reshaped everything we thought we knew. Speaking on Mobituaries with Mo Rocca, Annie explained that the song wasn't born out of joy at all. It came from conflict. After one of their many arguments, John stormed out and went skiing alone in Aspen. Riding the Ajax ski lift, surrounded by snowy silence, he suddenly found clarity. The melody arrived like a rush, and when he got home, still in his ski clothes, the lyrics poured out of him in just 10 minutes. It wasn't calculated, it wasn't polished. It was an apology set to music. Annie later called it a prayer more than a love song. That revelation changes how we hear the song. Every soaring note and every line isn't simply about love. It's about holding on to it, about choosing reconciliation at the breaking point. For Annie, it was deeply personal. Even decades after their 1982 divorce and John's tragic death in 1997, she admitted that hearing it still brings her to tears. Yet, curiously, it's not even her favorite Denver song. She prefers Perhaps Love, his duet with Placido Domingo, another track steeped in vulnerability and truth. What makes Annie's perspective so powerful is her refusal to romanticize the past. She doesn't erase the struggle, the fractures, or the weight of fame that eventually unraveled their marriage. Instead, she tells it as it was, messy, human, and complicated. To millions, Annie's song is a universal love anthem. To Annie, it's a window into one of the most fragile moments of her life, a reminder of both devotion and difficulty. In the end, it wasn't a lack of love that ended their marriage. It was the relentless demands of success. Fame, distance, and pressure chipped away until Annie not only lost her husband, but, as she admitted, she lost a part of herself. And yet, even now, she remembers with affection rather than bitterness. Her honesty stunned longtime fans, because when she finally broke her silence, she gave us something more enduring than a perfect love story. She gave us the truth, the fame that crushed their marriage. John Denver didn't just rise to fame, he became a symbol of 1970s America. With timeless hits like Take Me Home, Country Roads, Sunshine on My Shoulders, and Rocky Mountain High, he wasn't just topping the charts, he was capturing the spirit of a generation. But for Annie Denver, the quiet figure standing behind the man in the spotlight, that dream slowly unraveled. She had fallen in love with John before the world knew his name. Back when he was just a soulful young guitarist charmed by her flannel shirt and penny loafers. But as his fame grew, Annie began to fade into the background. They were only kids when they married in 1967. Annie just 20, John 23. Thrust into a whirlwind of red carpets, sold-out shows, and constant travel, neither had the tools to handle the pressure. Annie, who once found comfort in Minnesota winters and handwritten love letters, soon felt herself disappearing. "I didn't know who I was anymore," she later admitted. I lost my identity in his world. To fans, John seemed like the perfect husband. Gentle, romantic, grounded. But fame has a way of magnifying distance. Weeks apart turned into months. The easy connection of their early days, letters, laughter, quiet walks in Aspen, was replaced with silence and unspoken resentment. Even John acknowledged the damage. In a candid 1983 interview, just a year after their divorce, he admitted, "My success and my commitment to the work that I do certainly had an effect on Annie's and my relationship. Over the last 4, 5, 6 years, we started drifting away from one another. For Annie, it felt inevitable. We were too young," she said, "too immature to handle it." The speed of John's stardom swept her into a world she never asked for. And when the lights dimmed, the silence was unbearable. What many don't realize is that Annie chose not to air her pain. She never fought the divorce in public, never cashed in on the cracks in their marriage. For decades, she stayed silent, protecting the memory of a love that, for a time, had been real. But years later, Annie would finally admit the deeper truth. Fame didn't just strain their marriage, it erased her from her own story. She became the woman behind the man, immortalized in a song, but lost in the shadow of his dreams. And yet, Annie's story doesn't end with quiet heartbreak, because during their split, there was one moment, so raw, so unsettling, that it revealed just how far things had truly fallen apart. A moment she never spoke of publicly, until now. The chainsaw incident was real. It sounds like something out of a Hollywood drama. Too wild, too symbolic to be real. But it happened. In the final bitter stages of their divorce, John Denver, the man who wrote Annie's song, took a chainsaw to the bed he had once shared with Annie. Not a metaphor, a literal chainsaw. For years, fans dismissed the story as rumor, too out of character for the gentle folk icon. But both Annie and John later confirmed it. The rage wasn't random. It came after months of rising tension. One incident in particular ignited it. Annie had some trees removed from their Aspen property, a decision that cut John to the core. For him, nature wasn't scenery, it was sacred. Losing those trees felt like losing a part of his own soul. And so, in a fit of grief and fury, he grabbed a chainsaw. He stormed into their bedroom and tore through the bed. It was more than destruction. It was theater, heartbreak made visible, a symbolic way of splitting their life in two when words no longer worked. Years later, John didn't deny it. In his 1994 autobiography, Take Me Home, he went further, admitting he was emotionally unstable during the divorce. He confessed to violent outbursts, struggles with alcohol, and bouts of depression. The world saw the gentle troubadour, but behind closed doors, he was far more fragile and flawed than his music suggested. What's astonishing is how Annie responded. She never tried to tarnish his legacy. She didn't run to tabloids, didn't cash in on scandal. She carried the weight of those moments quietly, choosing silence for decades. Only in 2022, during her Mobituaries interview, did she finally share her truth. Not for revenge, not for drama, but to show that even the most poetic souls can break under the weight of a collapsing marriage. And yet, Annie's words still carry tenderness. She remembers the chaos, but she refuses to let it define John entirely. Perhaps that's why she held on to the first love letter he ever gave her. Perhaps that's why she never remarried. Perhaps that's why, even now, Annie's song still makes her cry. Because for Annie, the story of John Denver isn't just about the rage or the chainsaw. It's about love, loss, and the pieces of herself she held on to, even when the world only saw her as the woman behind the man. She still kept his first love letter. Some memories are simply too sacred to let go. For Annie Denver, now 78, one of those memories rests in plain sight on her desk. The very first love letter John Denver ever wrote her. Decades have passed since their whirlwind romance, marriage, and eventual divorce. But that single sheet of paper remains untouched by time. She doesn't hide it in a drawer. She keeps it where she can see it, where it can still reach her. In her 2022 Mobituaries interview with Moroka, she admitted softly, "I keep it on my desk now. It still moves me to see it." That quiet admission carries the weight of a love that once defined her life. Their story began in 1966 on the campus of Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. Annie was just a sophomore, an ordinary student playing a minor role in a light-hearted campus musical. John, still Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. at the time, was performing nearby with the Mitchell Trio. After the show, he joined students backstage. Annie wasn't center stage. She was the girl holding up signs for Act 1 and Act 2. But for John, that was enough. He remembered the flannel shirt, the blue jeans, the penny loafers, details that etched her into his memory. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was the start of something real. Months later, John began writing her letters, thoughtful, tender, filled with his hopes and insecurities. Annie responded, and before long, the foundation of their relationship was built on ink, paper, and honesty. Those letters carried them through the rush of John's rising fame, through the chaos of tours and the scrutiny of magazines. Annie has saved many of them, but the first remains the most precious. It reminds her of a time before the noise, before John Denver became a household name, before the bed-splitting fights, before the weight of the world bent their love out of shape. That first letter came from a boy who simply adored a girl in flannel. For John, Annie was a grounding force, someone to write to, sing to, return home to when the world grew too loud. For Annie, those letters were proof that behind the fame and the songs was just John, hers. But even the most beautiful beginnings can't shield love from life's harder truths. That letter may symbolize innocence, but it doesn't erase the heartbreak that followed. In fact, holding on to it only made some choices more bittersweet. After years of infertility, Annie and John made the difficult decision to adopt, welcoming Zachary and Anna Kate into their lives. Both children were deeply cherished, symbols of a family built on hope and resilience. And yet, Annie knows when she looks at that letter, it belongs to a time before, the time of pure intent, before the disappointments, before the silence, before the fame that chipped away at what they had. The letter doesn't lie. It's a snapshot of two young people who believed love could conquer all. But life, as Annie has learned, doesn't always bend to love's will. Why they adopted and what it meant. For all the music John Denver shared with the world, perhaps the quietest and most personal chapter of his life was fatherhood. Yet, that journey began in heartbreak. John and Annie longed for children, but years of infertility brought them private sorrow, something rarely spoken about in public. Behind the fame and love songs, Annie carried a silent grief, while John wrestled with the feeling that something essential was missing from their life together. Eventually, they chose adoption, not as a compromise, but as a new beginning. In time, they welcomed two children, Zachary John and Anna Kate, who became the very heart of their family. John later said that the first time he held Zachary, everything shifted. Success was no longer measured in albums or sold-out concerts, but in bedtime stories and quiet mornings at home. His joy was so profound that he wrote "A Baby Just Like You" as a Christmas song for his son, even including the line, "Merry Christmas, little Zachary." Annie embraced motherhood with quiet devotion, creating a warm, grounded home in Aspen, Colorado. Even after her divorce from John in 1982, she chose stability for her children over the spotlight. She never remarried, never sought attention. She simply raised Zachary and Anna Kate with patience, love, and dignity. Unlike many broken families, there were no bitter custody battles, no public accusations. Annie never let pain turn into poison. Instead, she taught her children love. Meanwhile, John's second marriage to Australian actress Cassandra Delaney in 1988 was very different. After a whirlwind romance, they had a daughter, Jessie Bell, but the relationship quickly unraveled. Delaney later described John as controlling and emotionally volatile. By 1993, The marriage had ended in divorce, a turbulent and public contrast to the quiet, respectful parting John had shared with Annie. The second wife called him a bully. To the public, John Denver embodied warmth. His gentle voice carried hope. His lyrics painted images of peace and belonging, and his boyish smile, framed by round glasses, became a symbol of wholesomeness. But behind the curtain, the man who sang love songs was far more complicated. For Cassandra Delaney, John's second wife, their marriage was anything but poetic. In her words, he was no tender balladeer, but a vindictive bully. Their story began in Sydney, where John, still healing from his quiet divorce from Annie, met Cassandra, a rising actress and singer. He was captivated. She was intrigued. What seemed like a fresh start soon turned into a whirlwind romance. By 1988, they were married, and a year later, they welcomed their daughter, Jessie Bell. But the joy was fleeting. Cracks in their marriage appeared almost immediately. Cassandra, unlike Annie, refused to stay silent. She later described John as angry, controlling, and emotionally volatile. Their Aspen home, once a sanctuary during his years with Annie, became a battlefield of mistrust. She recounted episodes of manipulation and outbursts that left her feeling trapped, painting a portrait of a man far removed from the beloved environmentalist adored by millions. The breakdown was swift and public. By 1991, they had separated. 2 years later, they divorced. Her accusations weren't dismissed as bitterness. They echoed troubling patterns already emerging in John's life. By the early 1990s, the clean-cut icon of the 70s was unraveling. He was arrested twice for driving under the influence, once crashing his Porsche into a tree. The Federal Aviation Administration revoked his pilot's license, citing his substance abuse, a devastating blow to a man who found his greatest peace in the skies. Even John himself began to admit what others had whispered. In his 1994 autobiography, Take Me Home, he confessed to drinking, drug use, mood swings, and even moments of violence in past relationships. For fans, the revelations were shocking. For those closest to him, they were simply confirmation. And yet, through the chaos, one thread never fully broke: Annie. Despite the divorce, despite marrying someone else, John never stopped holding on to her in some way. He continued sending her flowers on her birthday and on Mother's Day, quietly acknowledging the bond that had once defined his happiest years. She understood me, he admitted, before everything got complicated. Even as his life spun in and out of control, John remained tethered to Annie, right up until his final flight. The last words they ever shared. Some goodbyes don't sound like farewells until they are final. For Annie Denver, the last conversation with her ex-husband wasn't meant to be their last. It was just another phone call, a fleeting moment between two people who had once shared everything, and in some quiet ways still did. Yet the words exchanged would haunt her forever. As she later recalled on the Mobituaries podcast, the call began as most of their later conversations did, gently, cautiously. She thanked John for the flowers he sent every birthday and Mother's Day, even decades after their separation. But this time, he didn't just respond with politeness. "But Annie, I love you," he said. 4 simple words, unguarded, carrying the weight of love, loss, mistakes, and forgiveness. Annie answered softly, "I love you too." Neither knew it would be the final conversation they'd ever share. There was no closure, no staged reconciliation, no scripted farewell. Just a moment of truth between two hearts that had never truly stopped loving each other, hidden in their own quiet corner. Soon after, on October 12, 1997, John Denver boarded a small experimental aircraft near Pacific Grove, California. Flying had been a lifelong passion, inherited from his father, a decorated Air Force pilot, but the skies had grown complicated. After DUI convictions, the FAA had restricted his flight privileges. Still, John had returned to the air, taking risks that would prove fatal. That day, while performing touch-and-go maneuvers over Monterey Bay, the aircraft plunged into the ocean. He was 53. Saitino. For Annie, The news was devastating. The man who had written Annie's song in 10 minutes after a fight, whose voice had filled stadiums and later her children's bedrooms with lullabies, was gone. Yet somehow, a part of her had known. That final call, those 4 words, had felt like a goodbye disguised as love. She was left with memories, letters tucked in the desk drawer, photographs from Aspen, and a song that would always be hers. Even decades later, Annie's song still brings her to tears, not just for what it had meant then, but for what it continues to mean. It was like a prayer, she once said, and prayers, even whispered long ago, tend to echo. Annie never remarried. She stayed in Aspen, the town that had once brought beauty and peace into their lives, raising Zachary and Anna Kate with quiet strength. She refused to let the past define her. Yet, she never pretended it didn't shape her. Unlike many linked to celebrity, she never chased cameras, never gave tell-all interviews, never tried to rewrite history. Her silence, for decades, spoke louder than any headline. But silence didn't erase pain. Behind her calm exterior was a woman who had loved deeply, endured loss publicly, and chosen dignity over drama. In embracing grace instead of bitterness, Annie Denver became her own kind of legend, one forged not in fame, but in quiet, unyielding resilience. If this story touched you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share your favorite John Denver memory in the comments below. Hungry for more untold stories about legendary artists? Click on the next video on your screen. There's always more than meets the eye.